Perfect. Okay, so great. Good evening, everybody. So this is Eleni, and I'm super excited today to introduce our second speaker in our new program that is called Spotlight on Young Scholars. And I'm very excited to introduce Myrto Grigoroglou. I have a double reason to be very excited because Myrto not only is she an exceptional young scholar, and you will have an opportunity to see why I'm saying that, but also she is the academic child of one of our own, Anna Papafrago, that is on Zoom with us today, and that's kind of a double joy kind of event. So Myrto, just a few things. I know that you have all seen the information that we passed around. She is a psycholinguist, and just a minute ago I asked her when she starts talking to just tell us what a psycholinguist is. What do these people do? What is that kind of field? She did her PhD at the University of Delaware with, as I just said, advised by Anna Papafrago. And now she's a professor in the Linguistics Department and the Cognitive Science program at the University of Toronto. Before that, before she did her PhD, she started her career in Athens at the University of Athens. Then she did her master's degree in Paris. Then she did her PhD here at the University of Delaware, and now she's professor in Toronto. She has worked on a fairly wide range, actually, of topics. So I don't know if she's going to touch on all of it or some of it today.
I guess just one for today.
Just one for today. All very interesting topics that relate to how children use language for different purposes. I think the area that she will not talk about is a language and space, how we acquire a language that describes space and spatial relationships. And I think that she will talk about the part of the work that is about how children use language in communication. Do they understand what we need to know in order to understand language or not? Are they different from adults or not? I think something like that, right? So that's what she will talk to us about today. And she has received awards. She's an excellent scholar. I'm not going to go into the details because really the purpose of this program and this kind of invitation is for us to get to know her and her work more, both in breadth and depth, so we can all get inspired and get better informed about what other people are doing. And I really want to make sure that she has as time as she needs to do that. So I'm gonna give you the floor, Myrto, and thank you so very much for accepting the invitation. We were looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Eleni, so much. This was a lovely introduction. So hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today. In a sense, for me, this is like coming home because, as Eleni said, I was a student at the University of Delaware. That's where I did my PhD. So, Philadelphia and the broader Philadelphia area is sort of like a second home to me. So it's definitely very nice to be here. So today I will be talking about research that I have done as part of my PhD. So this is research that I have done with Anna, who is here today, and I'm very happy about that. This work is about children's early communication skills, so how they develop those skills, and specifically in this work we ask whether children adjust their speech, so their oral language production, to the informational needs of other people. So I will start off with a little bit of background about how we theorize communication in linguistics. And just to say, like what a psycholinguist does. So a psycholinguist is a linguist who studies language from a psychological perspective. So we are doing experimental research with people, and we are interested in the psychological processes that underlie language, so language production or language comprehension. And today I will be talking about processes of language production in adults and in children as well. So basically, when what you see on your screen is a picture that it's a snapshot of our everyday experience of the world. So there are two boys, there are two boys, they have a kite, they're at the beach, they're playing. And, this is a dynamic scene. And the question is, how do we talk to other people about experiences like this? So the question is, how do we, describe situations like this to other people, and what types of considerations go into our choices as speakers? So basically, what happens is that we as speakers, we choose linguistic expressions that make our messages easy for listeners to understand. And to achieve this, very often we have to think about what other people around us know in order to offer as much information as is needed for the purpose of the conversational exchange in which we are in. So for instance, if the speaker wants to refer to one of the two boys in the scene and they know that their listener can see both of these boys, they need to specify which one they mean, because there's two of them. So they need to modify their language production in an appropriate way. So here, what sets the two boys apart is their shorts. So the one boy is wearing blue shorts, the other boy is wearing gray shorts. So uniquely identifying the right referent means that the speaker needs to modify her expression. And this will help the listener understand what boy she's talking about. Because if she fails to do that and she doesn't modify her utterance appropriately, then the listener would not understand what she's talking about, and then this would lead in a communication failure. So basically, what I just described here is a collaborative process in which the speaker needs to think about what would be helpful for the listener to mention. So this cooperative property of linguistic communication has been characteristically captured by the work of Paul Grice, who is a British philosopher of language, who is considered actually the father of pragmatics, which is the area of linguistics that studies meaning in conversation. And according to Grice, to the Gricean model, which is a very influential model in pragmatics, conversation is governed by a general principle of cooperation. And what this principle says is that basically, as a speaker, you should make your conversational contribution, such as is required at the stage at which it occurs, with the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. Grice also proposed that there is other principles or maxims, as he called them, that govern conversation. And basically, these are assumptions that we make about whatever is said. So when someone says something, we assume that this utterance is truthful. So we are assuming that they are telling the truth in principle, and this is the maximum of quality. We also assume that whenever something is said, this is informative, and this is the maximum of quantity. Also, our contributions to conversation should be relevant. So they should be on the topic of the conversation that we are having and not about something else. And this is the maximum of relevance. And also our conversational contribution as speakers should be unambiguous. So as speakers, we should try to avoid ambiguity, and that's the maximum of manner. So within the Gricean framework, a particularly important principle, which I'm going to be talking about more today, is the principle of informativeness, which is Grice's maximum of quantity. And basically, this principle is about how informative a speaker needs to be in conversation. And this has two submaxims. So basically, speakers should make their contribution as informative as is required for the current purposes of the exchange, and they should not make their contribution more informative than is required. So basically, we need to be appropriately informative when we communicate with others. And the question that this work is asking is whether children are doing this and how they learn to do it, and what are the factors that affect the likelihood of them, observing the principle of informativeness in conversation. So this is the theoretical view of how this is described in linguistics. The question is, what happens with people? So, before I get into that, of course, this is the theoretical view, but again, speakers are not being informative in vacuum, but they're being informative for the sake of a listener, a conversational partner. And in order to be informative, you need to take into account what information you have in common with other people. So what information you share, something that we refer to as common ground in linguistics. So common ground can be established at different levels of specificity, and it can include information that we share in the perceptual context as participants in a conversation that takes place in the same physical environment. So for example, the two conversational partners that I showed you before who were viewing the same scene had access to the same type of perceptual information. We also can establish common ground as in prior discourse as participants in the same conversation. So here, I have talked to you about all these different types of terminology, so I can assume later on in this talk that this is a common ground that we share. And finally, common ground can be established at a more general level. So members of the same community share some type of information. So for example, we all here are Greeks or of Greek inheritance. So we can assume that we know that tomorrow is 25 Myrto, and we are celebrating the anniversary of the Greek Revolution. So there is information that is shared in different levels. A lot of research has been done with adults to see whether adults adjust their language production to match these different types of levels of information that are shared with listeners. And this research shows that adults are pretty flexible and they do take into account these different types of information. So for instance, it has been shown that adults offer more specific information when this is required by their listener's visual perspective. And this would be an example of adjusting your speech to the perceptual context that you share with someone else. It has also been shown by actually very classic work in this literature that was done in the late 60s, that over the course of the conversation, utterances become shorter and more efficient. And this is evidence that people do take into account information that was shared in prior discourse. And then finally, people also take into account general characteristics such as social identity of their listeners. So it has been shown that adults talk differently to other adults as opposed to infants, or native speakers talk differently to other native speakers as opposed to non-native speakers. Experts talk differently to other experts as opposed to novices. So adults are pretty flexible and they do take into account all these different types of information. So the question is, what is happening with children? And actually for children, the evidence is both more limited in scope and also it shows very mixed findings. So a way that this has been tested in children is by looking at whether they can adjust their speech to their listener's visual perspective. And a typical paradigm that is used in order to test for this is to present children who are the speakers in this case with a visual array of objects. So imagine that this is a 4x4 box that has different compartments. And the goal of this task is to ask a listener to pick up one of these objects. And two of these objects have to be the same kind of thing, but they are contrasting along one dimension. So here there's a short glass and a tall glass. So this is one condition, and in this case, the listener, the speaker knows that the listener can see both of these objects. So the listener is sitting on the other side of this box, which is an open box apart from one compartment, which is blocked. So this is one condition, and then in another condition, the listener can only see one of the two contrastive objects. So the other object is visible only to the speaker, but not to the listener. So if you are an informative...
Can I just do a very, very short, because now you're getting into the experiments. I just want to, maybe it's worth mentioning. I realized that when I first got familiar, or got very interested in pragmatics, and knew about GRICE, something that was not very obvious to me at the beginning, and then I got super excited about it, is why we care about this amount of how informative you are. And I was thinking, well, who cares to study this? I mean, what's the point? Well, I mean, why does it hurt if you can maybe give more information than is needed? I mean, yeah, I mean, why do you need a maxim to say, oh, no, you need to, it kind of at the beginning, it felt like it's a rule that people need to follow, and we tell them to follow that, which of course is not the case. And I just want to make sure that it's clear to people that not for this particular experiment, but the reason why this is all very important and exciting about how much information you give is because it explains a lot of linguistic meaning that we infer, and otherwise you wouldn't be able to. And I think not the best, but the easiest example to show is, for example, if we say, well, can you pass the salt? And we don't even sweat it, that we don't say, yes, I can, but we actually pass the salt, right? And, so how do we do that? Why are there so many instances in our language communication that we don't do exactly what the sentence says, right? Or we don't really adhere to the literal meaning of the sentence, but we do something else with it. So how does that happen? And it happens because of all the principles that you described. And I just wanted to say that because sometimes I think that out of context, you may not, who cares? Yeah, you just share a little more information, a little bit less information. If it's more, fine, I will ignore it. If it's less, sure, I'm going to ask for some more. But I think it is a very exciting, area because it explains the ways that we infer meaning that we would not be able to explain otherwise. So I just wanted to, because you're getting into your experiments, I just want to say that in case it's not very obvious to everybody.
Yeah, so I guess, like what you mentioned is a very nice example, the indirect request, which we don't even think about. When we talk, we don't even think that there's a hidden meaning there, because the question, like from its form, it seems to be about your ability to pass the salt, but it's actually not about your ability to pass the salt. It's a directive. So it's like, give me the salt. That's the meaning of this question. And we need pragmatics in order to interpret this appropriately. So we use pragmatics all the time for even the simplest things, and we exploit pragmatics both as speakers and as listeners as well. So I guess this case is more about the fact that we need to use pragmatics in order to even, like refer to a thing in our environment. Because, this is like an artificial situation in which, the experimenters have put objects in an array, but all the time we actually have to refer to things. So to say, okay, so I need this one and not that one. And, you can use pointing, sure, but very often you actually need to uniquely describe this in a way that is useful for your listener based on her knowledge. And this is just a simple case to test for that. So I guess in situations like this, if you are an informative speaker and you know that your listener can see both of these two glasses, you need to say, pick up the tall glass. If, however, you know that your listener can only see one, then you can just use an unmodified utterance and just say, give me the glass, and that's fine. And this, in both cases, you have effective communication and you make your listener understand what you're talking about. So this is how this thing is tested. It's very simple. And then, of course, adults in these simple cases are, they modify when the listener needs it. They don't modify if this is not needed. But how do children perform? Well, studies show that children have the ability to adjust their utterances to match what their listeners can or cannot see, and they can do this from a young age. So in this situation, preschoolers are more likely to say, pick up the tall glass when their listener can see both of the objects. But then if the listener sees only one object, then they will use the bear noun. So they will just say, give me the glass. And there is even evidence that children who are younger than age 3, so 2-year-olds, also modify their behavior to match what other people know. So for example, they've done experiments where they hide a toy and the mother is either present or absent when the toy is hidden. And it has been found that 2-year-olds are more likely to name the location of the toy or to point at it if the mother was not present. Thus showing evidence that, they do realize that their mother needs more information to figure out where the toy is. So they seem to be sensitive to what other people know in communication. But at the same time, there is also studies that show failures. So there are studies that show that children don't always do this. And there are studies that show that even at age 9, kids cannot do this, which is actually surprising because, 9-year-olds are linguistically very competent, but at the same time, they seem to have problems with being informative speakers. And even in, those studies that I showed you where you have like these 2 different conditions, 5-year-olds use a modifier to disambiguate less than 50% of the time. So although the listener needs it, 50% of the time, children fail to give the appropriate amount of information. So this is a big gap for kids. And this is a very well-established developmental picture, but the question is, why does it happen? And could we propose a model that could actually explain these divergent behavior in children? So before I get into the studies that I will be talking about today, I want to take a step back and consider a little bit what planning an informative utterance involves in terms of, the psychological processes that we need as speakers. So basically, planning utterances that are informative for others is a fairly complex process if one breaks it down. And it requires speakers to combine different types of information. So for example, if we take the case of disambiguation, then what the speaker needs to do is to scan the visual context in order to locate the critical, disambiguating information. So that's a first step. Then speakers also have to consider social information about their listeners. So I'm talking to another person. Who is this person? What is the type of information that we share already? What is the type of information that we don't share, but I need to tell my listener about? What is the social identity of this person? What is their goal in the conversation? And then, of course, speakers need to combine all this information with their linguistic knowledge in order to produce well-formed utterances. And of course, monitoring and coordinating all these different sources of information requires cognitive abilities. So prior work actually shows that basically children may have problems at each of these stages of production. So for example, there are studies that show that children may have difficulties with visual search, so they may not notice the differences in the visual context. There is also a lot of literature that is talking about performance difficulties, so maybe children don't have the linguistic resources that adults do, and this is what is limiting them from offering informative descriptions. And they may also have more limited cognitive resources more generally. However, an important possibility that has been overlooked in the literature, and that's the possibility that we have explored in this work, is that children may have problems with informativeness itself, so social difficulties with informativeness. So maybe they cannot estimate, they cannot decide what is worth talking about from the perspective of a listener in a way that goes beyond narrow considerations about what the other person can or cannot see, which is what the prior literature has mostly focused on. So basically in this work, what we ask is what is the nature of children's difficulties with informativeness and whether they design utterances with the informational needs of their listener in mind. So to answer this question, we have made two proposals. So the first proposal is that children's ability to adjust their speech to the informational needs of a listener is not an all or nothing ability, as is often claimed. So, in the literature, we see, they are treating this issue as an all or nothing kind of thing. So whether children have the ability to take into account other people's perspective in communication or they don't. So what we are suggesting is that this might not be the case, and this ability might be graded in a way that I will describe later. And then the second proposal in this research is that basically the likelihood of children adjusting their speech to the conversational needs of others may have to do with the nature of the interaction itself. So what are the what is the communicative situation in which they are engaging with? What are the characteristics of their listener? So the starting point for our first proposal was some observations that were made in the adult psycholinguistics literature concerning the types of adjustments that speakers make for the sake of listeners. And so far, I have been talking to you about adjustments that speakers make for the sake of listeners' visual perspective, or of adjustments that are made based on information that was shared in prior discourse. And these are adjustments that we make for specific people that we have interacted with. So we have a person in front of us, that's our listener, and we sort of monitor what they can or cannot see, and we adjust our speech accordingly. So this is an adjustment that is geared towards a specific listener, so a particular listener adjustment. But it has also been observed that speakers make other types of adjustments that may not have a specific listener in mind. So for example, when people are asked to describe scenes that involve something unusual, then they are more likely to mention this unusual thing in conversation just because it is unusual for anyone, not because of the person that they have in front of them. So for example, there was research done in the early 80s where they looked at how people tell stories. And they had stories that involved instruments. And for example, they had instruments that were usual. So for example, this is a stabbing event and there is a knife used. So in cases like this, people were not very likely to mention the knife because, anyone can assume that if there is a stabbing going on, then a knife is used. But people were more likely to mention an instrument if it was unusual. So if there was a knife pick used, then speakers would be more likely to say that the man stabbed another man with a knife pick. So basically, the unusual information made its way into a sentence just because it was unusual and it was not easily predictable by any type of listener, not just the person that you have in front of you. So basically, when we think about production processes, this may happen at two different levels here. So based on this observation in adults, we hypothesized that this type of distinction might also play a role in children as well. And it may also explain why we see the divergent findings in the developmental literature. So we did experiments with children and adults. So these were English-speaking children who were 4 to 5 year olds and adult controls. And we asked them to watch videos and describe them for a listener. And we had videos involving instruments. And for each video, for each type of event, we created 2 versions. So here you can see the typical version of this event. So a man is cleaning the countertop with a rug. And then our other version was the unusual instrument. And here you can see a man cleaning the countertop with a teddy bear. So basically, you know, when we do experiments, we try to keep things simple. You know, this is an everyday action and it's performed by the same male agent. And then what we varied here was the typicality of the instrument, and people just watched events like this and just described them to another person. And so for each type of event, people only saw one version. So here I'm showing you both, but people only watched one of these. But in total, they got both typical and atypical instruments. So there were 12 events in total, 6 typical, 6 atypical. We did this in order to test for people's generic adjustments. So as I told you before, if you mention, if something is unusual, then you're more likely to mention it. And that would be a generic adjustment because this is something that any listener would need. So in this case, no one would be able to guess that a teddy bear is used unless you tell them. Then we also wanted to explore particular adjustments, so adjustments to particular listener needs. And in order to do that, we manipulated the listener's visual access to the videos. So for half of the participants, the listener was sitting right next to the speaker, the subject, and they could see the same computer screen, so they could see the videos. So they had the same level of knowledge. And then for the other half of the participants in the no visual access condition, the listener was sitting right across the table, so they could not see the computer screen, they could not see the video. So in this case, they needed more information, basically, from the speaker. So this is how we manipulated that. And now I'm ready to show you the results of the study. So basically, what you see graphed here is the proportion mentioned of instruments by children and adults. And we have the 2 visual access conditions. So visual access for the listener and no visual access for the listener. And the red bar is the unusual, the atypical instruments. The blue bar is the typical instruments. So, of course, first difference that we found was that adults were overall more informative than children. So they mentioned instruments much more frequently. The other thing that we found was that both children and adults mentioned atypical, unusual instruments more frequently than the typical one. So they were very likely to mention the teddy bear, but they were less likely to mention the rug in the example I showed you. So they both made this generic adjustment for the listener. But then when we look at whether they took into account the perspective of the listener, only adults took into account the perspective of the listener, and they mentioned instruments more frequently when the listener did not have visual access to the event. But for children, visual access did not matter. So they offered the same amount of information to the listener. So basically, from this set of studies, I only presented one experiment. There were more, but this is basically the main finding. So adults flexibly adjusted their utterances to match both generic and particular listener needs. So they did both the typicality-based adjustment and the visual access-based adjustment. Children, however, were less flexible, so they did make the generic, the typicality-based adjustment, but they did not adjust to the visual perspective of their listener. So if you remember, there were two proposals. So the first one was confirmed, and this distinction between generic and specific adaptations did lead to distinct developmental patterns. But we had a second proposal, and this concerned whether children's likelihood of adjusting their speech to listeners has to do with the nature of the interaction with this listener. So basically, for the second proposal, again, there is evidence from adults that adults are more likely to make particular listener adjustments when their listeners have or are perceived to have actual informational needs. So for example, if you tell them that the listener is distracted, they are less likely to give information. But if you tell them that if they see that their listener is engaged, they're more likely to give information. But this factor has not been tested in children. So basically, our second prediction was that if we manipulate listeners' profiles across experimental tasks, we may see differences in both children's and adults' production adaptations, such that both groups might be more informative for the sake of more interactive listeners. So in another set of studies, we looked into this question more specifically, and we had a design that was similar to the one I just presented, but in this case, instead of videos, we had static pictures of agents performing actions using events, and they were presented, the typical and atypical versions were presented side by side. So this was a disambiguation task. So basically, one of the two pictures was circled. The pictures are identical. The only difference is the instrument used. So the woman on the top picture is sweeping the floor with a broom. And then in the target picture here, she's using a tree branch to sweep the floor. So again, we had this typical, atypical instrument manipulation. And then we also manipulated visual access like before. So for half of the participants, the listener was sitting in a way that she could see the computer screen. And for the other half of the participants, the listener could not see this picture. So she did not know what was the target picture. And then the critical manipulation here, which is new compared to the paradigm that I showed you before, is that we manipulated how interactive the listener was. So in the first experiment in this series, the listener was passive. So the listener was just sitting there listening to the participants, which I should say is a very common thing that happens in these types of experiments. So it's very common to have a child describe something to a passive listener, someone who's just standing there. And then in experiment 2, we took certain steps to make the listener more interactive in a way that was controlled experimentally. So we made this a guessing game, and then the goal of the listener was to find the right picture based on what the kids were saying. And then the listener also had a sticker that was placing next to the picture that she thought was the right one. So I should mention that the listener also had a binder with the same pictures, but without the circle. So the listener did not know what the target was. And we also presented this listener as naive to the participant. So there was some action involved. And then the listener was allowed to say something before and after each trial, but without asking for feedback. Because in real conversation, we are asking for feedback. If someone says, oh, it's the girl, you would say, which girl? The one with the tree branch or the one with the broom? This is what happens in actual conversation. But in experiments, we don't allow for that. And we didn't allow this for this here. We just wanted the listener to just say, oh, tell me, which one is it? Oh, yeah, I think I got it. So just that, no really corrective feedback on how informative children's utterances were. So these are the results from the two experiments. So first you see experiment 1 with the passive listener. Again, what you see graphed here is the proportion mention of instruments, typical and atypical. So I'm not going to focus on that. So here we also had two separate age groups for 4- and 5-year-olds because we were interested in the developmental trajectory. And we do see that, 5-year-olds are a bit better than 4-year-olds. So there is development happening during this age. But what I want you to focus on is that in the second experiment, where the listener was interactive, children were much more likely to mention instruments. So basically all these huge failures that we see here are not as huge in the second experiment. So children do become much more informative when their listener is interactive. So basically interactivity did play a role here. So our second proposal is also confirmed, and the nature of the interaction does matter for children. So speakers' informativeness heavily dependent on the listener's involvement. So children and also adults, this was an overboard effect, were more informative when communicating with an interactive listener in a collaborative exchange. Of course, the question is, what is the model that we are proposing here? And can this explain prior literature? And we believe that it can. So we started out with a model of a listener based on common ground, the set of shared information. And what we see in this research is that for children, maintaining a particular model of the listener was actually costlier compared to maintaining a more generic one. So instead of thinking about children's adjustments to listeners as an all or nothing kind of thing, we can think about this as a continuum. And on the one end, we had the typicality-based adjustments, which were based on generic assumptions about, what is considered usual, typical, or what is considered atypical. And children did make this adjustment very frequently. And this is not a very costly adjustment because it is based on stable representations about generally known facts. So we know that to perform, to clean, you use a rag and you don't use a teddy bear. So that's a stable representation that children had already. On the other end of the spectrum, we have adjustments that are made for someone's visual access, and these require highly particular assumptions about the person that you have in front of you. And children in our studies did not make these types of adjustments. And we propose that the reason is because these are cognitively demanding, so they require you to monitor what the other person knows at each point in the discourse. And to update these representations moment by moment. And this is something that children find hard. And then we saw that children did adjust their speech to the communicative profile of the listener, which we can also consider as a type of a particular adaptation because it's a particular listener who's been interactive or non-interactive. But again, this is a type of assumption that you can make only once for a specific person. It doesn't require constant monitoring and updating. So can this explain prior literature? We believe that it can once it becomes clear that different studies have actually tested different listener-oriented adaptations. So the studies with very young children did not require them to update the representations of another person's perspective in real time, but just to remember whether this person was present or absent during the presentation of some facts. So for example, the kids in a study that I mentioned earlier, the 2-year-olds who adjusted their speech to whether their mother had witnessed the hiding. The only thing they had to remember was mommy present when this was hidden or not. But then the studies that show highly divergent behavior are the ones that require subjects to contrast their own perspective to someone else's. So there is contrasted perspectives here, and they need to do this on a trial by trial basis in an experiment. And I didn't mention this, but there are studies that are testing generally known facts, so adjustments to those types of shared information, and children seem to be very consistent with these since age 3. So we also saw that interactive contexts increase informativeness in children, and we are proposing that this is because these collaborative exchanges with highly active interlocutors increase informativeness because they maximize the speaker's expected gains, and they reduce the burden of conversation for one person. So imagine that if you're communicating with someone who is also active, you don't have to bear the burden of achieving meaning yourself. So there is the other person to also share the burden with you. So this can decrease your costs. The question is, can this finding explain prior literature? And again, we believe that it can, because if one takes a closer look at the methods of different experimental tasks, they will observe a pattern. And this pattern shows that children are more likely to show perspective taking in communication when they're communicating with someone in an experiment who might be, a research assistant, a confederate, as we say in these studies, but who is interactive. So there is, some action being performed, or it could be another naive participant. It could be a parent. It could be another child, a peer. So someone who has real informational needs, a real person. On the other hand, children are less likely to show informative production if they're asking to describe something for the primary experimenter, which very frequently happens in these types of studies, or sometimes children are asked to describe things for an imaginary addressee, who is like a computer, a cartoon character on a computer screen. They're told, okay, this is SpongeBob. Can you tell SpongeBob which object they should pick up? And in these cases, children are not offering the appropriate information. So just to sum this up, are children informative speakers? Well, this is a question that doesn't have an all or nothing answer. So instead, we saw that adjusting your production to someone else's need should be seen as a set of distinct cognitive abilities whose degree of difficulty spans a continuum. And another takeaway message from this research is that speaking happens in an actual exchange, and that children, similarly to adults, need to perceive listeners' needs as genuine, and that's when they engage in informative communication. So I would like to thank everyone who made this research possible. Anna, who is here today, who is my supervisor and the co-author on this work, and the subjects who participated, and our funders. And thank you for listening to my talk today.
Thank you very much, Myrto. Thank you.
I guess
I have about 10 questions, but I'm gonna give the floor first to others. And then I'll take a turn if, depending. So I'm gonna open it for questions.
I perceive, this is George here. I perceive that this is very informative discussion, and I have no idea, of course, of all the details, simply because I'm not in that field, but I'm very appreciative of the fact that I learned something, and this something has to do with informativeness in child's production. Is, I think, a reflection of the listener. This is the way I interpreted most of the your presentation. I wanted to ask you, to what extent informativeness for a child is also in the production function for a child, is also a function of the context of the environment within which the listener or others participate. And the practical example might be, let's take your experiments here in Canada, for example, and take it also, because we are with Greek background, in Greece. the institutional setting, the social setting is completely different. So is there a function, the informativeness in the child's production is a function of the culture and context? Is it or is it not? And to what extent, if it is, you are in your studies, you account, you control for those factors?
I guess, you know, I haven't come across literature claiming that there is cultural differences in these abilities. So I guess, you know, you can think of situations where some factors could play a role. So for example, you know, like if we're thinking about classroom settings, you know, this might be completely different in the States as opposed to China, let's say. But as far as I know, no cultural differences have been found for these types of abilities. So we sort of assume that, you know, they universally proceed in a similar way. But then, you know, I guess what this research also shows is that these abilities do depend on context. So I can imagine situations where, you know, some contexts might be more helpful than others for children. So I cannot exclude the fact that this can happen, but as far as I know, we haven't seen of any differences, you know, cross-cultural differences, for instance.
Thank you.
I have a question. Have you seen, as an educator, I'm retired now, but I taught for 40 years. And I noticed over the years that learning styles evolved. One of our challenges was always to keep students motivated, keep them engaged. And I found that later in my career, I found that children, because of TV and video games, they became more visual and needed more of that stimulation to stay engaged. Did you find that in your studies?
So I guess we haven't seen this, but we haven't done, you know, like longitudinal studies, I don't know, like 30 years ago with kids, and then today using the same stimuli and all of that. So I can't, you know, like really address this aspect, but definitely, you know, what our studies show is that motivation to communicate plays a big role in how informative children are in communication. And of course, over the years, you know, like how this motivation is achieved may change based on children's experiences. So I can see this happening, but, you know, like provided that you offer them the same types of, the same levels, I guess, of motivation, then you should expect them to perform similarly. But I guess what underlies this motivation, so how this motivation is achieved, could be changing over the years.
And I did have one more question, and it involved bilingual children or multilingual children. Mm-hmm. Because there are different beliefs, and some educators think that it harms the child. I'm of the opposite range. I feel as though bilingual children, they develop, I think, cognitively better, and that it actually helps them. What did your studies show?
So I guess we haven't tested bilingual children in our work, but what the literature shows is that basically perspective taking in communication might be affected by bilingualism, and that actually, you know, bilingual children may have an advantage in perspective taking in communication. And, you know, like a theory behind this is because when you change from one language to the other, you need to inhibit one language and use the other. And you also need to keep track of what each listener knows. So you need to make adjustments all the time. So mom speaks Greek and dad speaks English, or, you know, like whatever combination you can find. So this is something that they learn to do from very early on. And, they need to suppress their knowledge of English, perhaps when they're responding to mom. So these type of everyday engagement with these, challenges actually makes them better in communication. So they do seem to perform better in these types of tasks, bilingual children.
Thank you. My theory of
It's correct.
boosting
Yes.
brain power. Thank you.
There is a question on the chat that I think is in the group of questions that George started. So I think it has to do with confounding factors or not. So the question is by Dimitra: what influences children's speech? Their communication production is standard by age group, or does it depend on prior parental verbal interaction? And I think that she means, how much. I mean, I don't think you control for that, but could that be a factor, right? That, that depends on how much prior experience the kid had in situations like that with their parents versus not.
Right. So I guess, first age, all of these factors play a role. So age does play a role. So the older you are, the more informative your speech is. So this is, like something that is a fact. And that's how, there is development here. So we are starting from one point and then we become, mature communicators. So this happens somehow, and it's through development and experience with communication. Certainly, parents, parental input plays a role, and also the types of interactions that children have with parents. So we know from the literature that actually you can train kids in certain ways, and certain trainings achieve better results with informative production than others. So for example, if you have a study like this and your child, which is very frequent, right? So whoever has interacted with children knows this. Children are often very under-informative. So they say, oh yeah, I want the sticker with a girl, but then there are two girls, the one sweeping with the broom, the other one sweeping with the branch. So they may say, give me the girl. If you tell them, oh, which one do you want? The one sweeping with the broom or the one sweeping with the tree branch? Then they're like, oh, I want the one sweeping with the tree branch. And then, there is scaffolding happening there, and this can improve their communication skills. So if you ask them again later in a different task, you do see that they can transfer these skills that they learned before. So if you have children and you want them to, get better at this, that's the way to go. So definitely, I can see how different families may provide different types of feedback like this, and some families might actually, be more effective this way than others. So I can see a role for input here.
Yeah, it is already 4 minutes after 8, but I do want to ask a quick question, only as if you have any pointers. So recently I reviewed and reminded myself of all the literature on space and language, and you'll see how it relates to the informativeness, because I've been involved in a language and vision navigation task where you talk to a robot and you're trying to navigate it to get to the right place. And I'm just wondering if what happens there with kids and instructions and the level of informativeness in the instruction. So if you want to direct a kid, right? If you want to help a kid navigate to a point around the house, right? Or if a kid has as a task to give instructions for somebody,
not all of it.
To navigate, would there be any differences there between adults and children of different ages? And if there are differences, are they irrespective of a notion of self-centeredness and self, I want to say self-centeredness, I mean
egocentricity, right?
Yeah, what's in for me? Am I trying to navigate you so you can find the chocolate and bring it to me, or just because there is some kind of general purpose task and you just ask me to do it?
Okay, so there is a lot of components in your question. So I guess you're asking about both comprehension and production, right? Okay. So I guess because, this is spatial navigation, depending on the age of the kids, you cannot say left and right because they don't know what this means until fairly, like late, or you can, there's ways to do this left and right thing by, having them use their hands or like their own body and like, oh, like the hand that you use to do this, turn that direction. So you could like modify instructions.
I was thinking landmarks more, like the use of landmarks.
Okay. So, I mean, certainly, I don't know how good kids would be in like taking instructions. I can assume that they, depending on the instructions, right? So that they would achieve this easily. But in terms of like guiding someone else to do it, I guess, because you mentioned motivation as well. Is there like a chocolate that you're bringing back to me or something like that? I guess you need to build in the task that this is a collaboration. So we're working together towards achieving a goal. So you don't have to offer an explicit reward because we didn't here. So we didn't, the kids didn't win anything at the end. They were just told, okay, you'll play a guessing game. There's no gains, no actual gains. So it was just like psychological gains of participating in a collaborative activity with someone else. So I guess, if you set it up this way, then kids would be, they would do their best. They would, have the motivation in and be as informative as they can, given, their abilities and their age and all of that. So in terms of like, building the tasks such that you give kids the best chance to perform, that's what my recommendation would be. And then I guess maybe the same goes for comprehension. So, if you set it up again in a way that it's a collaborative endeavor, then they would be, I guess, more receptive to hearing those instructions and really engaging. But of course, I would have to like see the instructions and like the ages of the kids to just, give a more specific answer.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I mean, as I said, as you saw, I already sneaked in 3 questions in one. So, I could keep going forever. I think this is really very interesting work and trying to tease apart, what is possible for kids, what is not possible for kids,
right?
Cognitively, versus whether there are other factors that affect to what extent the kid is, what is, I think what I understood from your work, and I think it's very exciting, is that you're trying to figure out what is the edge, right, of you cannot go any further because cognitively, no matter what, you cannot be there, versus how willing are you to try, or what are the circumstances where there is a cognitive ability, just that you are too lazy to use it or too unmotivated to use it or whatever, right? Or not in a situation, right? And I think that your work shows this kind of middle ground, which is very interesting, because if you don't look in the middle ground, you can very quickly say, well, it's just, cognitively you're not there, but you're showing all this space in between where maybe there is cognitive capabilities you can reach out to, only for some reason you're not reaching for them. And I think that
right. But of course, these abilities have a limit, right? So they're not like adults, at least preschoolers. And I guess you need to get to like age 12 or something to see adult-like performance in these types of tasks.
But it's a more sophisticated picture that you're drawing, when you can see, that you can actually push it a little bit, right?
Exactly.
So that's really fascinating. Well, thank you so much. I think we have overextended your visit.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I really appreciate it. And yes, and as I said, this is recorded and we're going to be sharing this. It's been a lot of fun and very informative, and we're very, very grateful that you made the time to come here and share your work with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was great being here, talking about my work and meeting everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.